question that really I think should be answered is why the hell should you even listen to me? And few reasons because and even though I've got it right at the top, not just because I wrote Growth Hacking for Dummies, but really I was the dummy. 8-9 years ago, this is the book I wish I had, so I wrote it for myself 8-9 years ago. As somebody who knew nothing about it. And I was one of those really lucky people who actually began their growth career right here at Growth Hackers, working directly with Sean. And at that time, Growth Hackers was nothing but a passion side project. And I was brought on, at this sort of inflection point when we're starting to think about this passion project more seriously as a business, and expanded it out from a community into the SaaS product that exists today, I think, which is now Experiments. It's been called many things in the past, and through all of the learning we did, we were able to understand how we can incorporate training into this. How can it become a conference? And so it grew from this small little thing into all of these big things that are following the exact process I'm going to talk about today. And following that experience, I had the chance to work at a category defining product where I owned the site that launched a specific category called talent optimization for a company called the Predictive Index. And this focuses more on the human side of growth, because as I learned, growth is not just about the processes, which is what we'll majorly talk about today, but it's also about the people behind the processes. And Sean was very good about ensuring that we had a great team to execute on the processes. And Growth Hackers has, of course, opened out the doors for me to talk to, advise, mentor a lot of startups at a lot of accelerators and other similar organizations. So I've started to see a lot of the similar patterns, and I've had a chance to test out everything I learned at Growth Hackers, to see, hey, is it only working because Sean's there, or does it work even if he's not in the picture? And I'm sort of happy to report that the truths hold true and the process holds true. So again, everything you see here will be things that I think I've vetted many times over. So hopefully that's reason enough to sit and listen through this thing longer, right? And before I say anything else, right, I want to sort of just dispel one big thing up front, which is that a lot of people mistake growth for something they need to do as soon as they have an idea or as soon as they can. But the number one rule of growth is that until you have validated what you have and what value you have for somebody, you should not be growing it. And this is quite honestly one of the biggest reasons products and startups fail. So, getting to product market fit, what all of that entails, that's a whole separate series of talks, but, and a lot of content on it on Google, but you should, if you take away nothing else from any of this, know that you should not be growing anything that has not been validated yet. Okay. So with that said, again, I told you this wasn't going to be some boring sort of talk. There's going to be a lot of interactivity. So, first, before I tell you what it is, I'd be interested in what all of you all think what it is, right? So, Jordana, if you can throw up that first poll, let's get a sense from whoever's here, so what they think it is. Might be able to see, right? I think most of y'all, picked an answer, which would have been my answer, as well. But I completely understand for the people that picked the other answers, because I've heard this a lot as well. Is when people think, oh, it's just marketing, and that may well be true for certain kinds of products. That the way you apply and think about growth is just all marketing because that's the kind of product you have. And I think that's the beauty of, I think this sort of discipline that Sean decided to put a new sort of word or spin around, is that it's big enough to encompass whatever's already been done, right? And this has sort of been the source of a lot of hot debate on the internet, right? That, oh, it's just product development, it's just marketing. And if the way you have done marketing has been all about learning how to grow value to users, then that's what growth or growth hacking is, right? Or if that's the way you've already developed a product, then that's what growth hacking is. Like nobody's mandating that, growth hacking must mean one specific thing. But the one thing we absolutely have to agree on is that it is about learning how to grow value to users. So even when we think about, these could be tactics to launch products, and acquire users. Sure, that's an aspect of growth, right? Because without users, how will you grow value to them? But for most products, it isn't just that. But this is, as we'll sort of see, that this is a very common perception about growth and growth hacking, that it really has to do a lot, with acquiring users, right? And we'll see, whether how true or not true those sort of perceptions might be as we move, further along this talk. Right. So with that said, I'll give you my quote unquote boring definition, right? Which is, it's really a process, right? And it's a process of sort of just continually testing and rapidly learning, across the sum of all the experiences your customer have with your product, right? And it's through that process that you learn about what are all the things that you can repeat, what are all the things you can scale, because that's how you learn about how to grow value systematically to your customers. Right? And so, this feels sort of a little textbooky, right? And this is quite honestly not the way I really internalized what this really sort of meant. So the way that made it easy for me to learn what it is, right, was to think about it as a game of battleship. Right? And I wish I had come up with this analogy, and I haven't, so I'm stealing it from someone much smarter than me. But assuming, all of y'all have played Battleship at some point in your life. If you haven't, it's simply a game of, you have a grid with some ships on a grid, and the opponent cannot see the grid, and you have these bombs that you can throw anywhere on the grid, and you call out where on the grid you're going to throw this bomb. And if it misses, you say miss. If it hits, you say hit. And the reason this is a perfect analogy for understanding how to grow value to users, right, is because when we first start out, we don't really know, right? And there are many pieces to value that we have to learn. It's not ever going to be one thing, right? And so just as when playing Battleship with somebody, the person who wins, right, is the person who learns fastest about how to grow value to users. Similarly with Battleship, right, the person who wins the game, right, is the person who learns fastest about where the other person's ships are, right? So the process is as much about learning what not to do as it is about what to do, right? And the only way you can learn what not to do, right, or the things that don't grow value to users, is to keep trying new things out, right? And you have to do it sort of smartly, right? Because again, and we'll talk about what smartly means, but the person that wins, right, is the person that learns fastest about where the other person's ships are, or in the case of products, the person who learns fastest about what user motivations are and what works for them, and to deliver on those needs, right? So it's a great sort of analogy for that. The other reason it's a great analogy is because it sort of dispels this myth of there's this one magical big growth hack that's going to work and suddenly it'll solve all of your problems, right? Whereas really you have to continually discover pieces of value about your users. And that's analogous to having all of these ships. Is once you find a particular opportunity, or in this case a ship, right, that particular opportunity is only going to last for a certain period of time, and then you're almost going to be back to square one, or in other cases you're going to have to find ways to build on that foundation, right? Which means, again, trying out a lot of things really fast and learning faster than your competition about what works and what doesn't work, right? And so to me, this is a much better way of sort of visualizing basically what you will be doing for your product as well, is you constantly throwing pings out, looking for signal, and once you find a signal, doubling down on that signal. And once you've exhausted that signal, looking around for where else could I find other signal, right? So hopefully that makes the concept a little bit more approachable and understandable for all of you, right? Which then brings up, okay, so that's fine, but why is it really relevant, right? Or really, why should you care, right? So, and there are many reasons you may or may not care. So, let's throw up the next poll on this one. Again, these are multiple choice clearly, so feel free to pick as many as you think. Really, the answer is all of the above. And there's a reason I didn't put in all of the above, because that would have given away that all of the above, was the right answer here, right? But I understand why some of you may have picked certain ones versus others, because that may just have been informed, by your own experience. Um, and but I want to address sort of each of these sort of individual answers with you, right, as to why you should care, because really because it has a lot to do. In fact, it has pretty much the only thing growth hacking has to do is with growing value to users. And as I just talked about, right, there's a process to testing and learning about what grows value. By definition, it's a process, right? So which means you have to find systematic ways of doing things versus what you likely have read a lot, whether you're on Twitter or LinkedIn, or some latest TechCrunch article that you've read about, oh, these are the 10 headlines you should use on Facebook to get a 20,000% conversion rate, right? Those are tactics, right? And whenever you read an article like that, right, you have to ask the question, right? So why did you do that? Right? And the answer to that why generally is because they've learned something about the motivations or the needs or how their audience behaves, which means they have followed a process to learn more about those things, right? And with how that sort of that North Star for you to understand that everything we do is through the lens of understanding how to grow value to users. Trying to do tactics in isolation is not going to get you growth, right? So you have to focus on a process as a function, right? There is also a cliche, right, when it comes to growth, which is that it's a team sport, and that's absolutely true, right? And it's simple math, right? Because one person is not going to be able to do as much as 10 people doing the exact same thing, right? Or if I was one person in a boat trying to row from one end of the river to the other, and there were 10 people in the next boat, they would get there faster, right? And so if again everything we do is look at things through the lens of how do we understand how to grow value to our users, then by definition all of us have to work together to understand that, right? And that's why it's super important. And if you look at any company that's been successful with growth, it's because they have understood how to align each of their teams to this common goal of how to grow value delivered. And they have understood how to collaborate around all of the activities that then help grow value delivered, right? And I'll make this a little bit more concrete, towards the end as well. Now, because we look at everything through the lens of value delivered, and you're going to get sick of hearing me say the phrase value delivered, but really that's really what everything boils down to is, right? We can now set some very measurable goals, right, around what is value, how do we quantify value, and that then forces everybody in the team, right, to not just do whatever they feel like or do some fancy new tactic or suddenly use TikTok because everybody wants, suddenly B2B is using TikTok, right? But to use the information they have, whether that is information that is quantitative in their analytics or whether that is qualitative through some user research or user reviews, whatever that may be, to then understand, okay, now that we understand X, Y, and Z about our audience, so we understand A, B, and C about why they do a certain thing or why they behave a certain way, that should then inform what we do next versus what is otherwise known as the hippo, right? Or which is an acronym for the highest paid person's opinion. And I'm reasonably sure all of us have dealt with this sort of person, right? So understanding that what we are doing is all about growing value delivered and being able to quantify value delivered then allows everybody to take a data informed approach to how we do what we do, right? And by definition, right, when we say value delivered, we're talking about it from a customer perspective, right? Because the thing that leads to silos and is the sort of enemy of collaboration, right, is that everybody tends to care about their own metrics, right? And with a customer focused metric like, hey, value to customers, right, by definition it improves focus to customers, because now that is all we care about, and everything we do is in the service of growing value delivered, right? And so this has a really massive impact even on like how we make products, right? Because everything we do in a product then is in the service of growing value delivered, right? So generally product departments are very concerned with, releasing new features on time, and all of that is great. You should release new features, but if you don't understand whether or how those new features are going to help grow value delivered, you can release all the features you want. It doesn't really matter, right? On the other end of the spectrum, engineers and engineering teams, at times are very concerned with fixing bugs, and there will always be bugs in product. But if you're not fixing the kind of bugs that are getting most in the way of users experiencing value, then you're not fixing the right kind of bugs, right? Or if customer support is getting a lot of input and a lot of tickets from the customers, that's great. But without an understanding in that department about, okay, which of these tend to be more in the category of users experiencing value versus something that might be an enhancement for the future, as an example, them understanding that can help them make better recommendations to a product department, or to a growth department, to say, hey, we keep hearing these sorts of things, can we start to test A, B, and C? And again, that helps a feedback loop of making the customer experience so much better, right? So there is a great unifying power in this discipline and in this process, right, which quite frankly isn't spoken about as much, right, but has very real implications on not only your organization's ability to institute this process, but then to carry on using this process through the lens of value delivered. But you will just not have the discipline without a process like this, which then impacts across the board every piece of the organization and literally everything that the organization does, right? So hope that sort of helps open up a few sort of minds about why this process sort of is something you should really care about, right? So which I think is a natural lead in, right, to, there's a lot, I hear this stuff every day. Like I don't know how many of you have seen this. I see this regularly, but maybe I won't talk about it. I'll talk about it maybe once you all do the poll. So, but I'm curious to hear, what are all the things you all have heard about, what growth hacking might or might not be. And the reason for this, and Sean himself will admit this, right, is that what he never did a great enough job of was completely codifying, sort of the basic principles of growth hacking. Right, and what it sort of really entailed, and what that allowed for is a lot of bad actors to come in and put their own spin on what growth or growth hacking really meant, right? And so when somebody saw something really shady, I mean, I've seen these on Twitter all the time where you have this growth hacking in quotation marks, right? And every time I see those, I have that reaction of like, that is not what Sean really meant when he coined the phrase, right? And generally people have this feeling when it has to do with tricking people into behaving a certain way or signing up or paying for your product. And I think one of the words that gets missed about growth hacking, right, is that what this is, while it is about growing value to our users, what it's really about, right, is about finding sustainable ways to grow value to users, right? And if we're talking about growing value, right, it logically doesn't hold that if you're trying to trick somebody into doing something, right, that they would continue to use you. Like tricking somebody is not a sustainable way to get them to continually use your product and to evangelize your product, right? So those sort of statements are just logically at odds with each other. But again, it's because we've had enough bad actors co-opt what it means. There's a lot of association with spammy and shady tactics that get associated with growth hacking, right? So I completely understand if you felt like that is something is really true and associated with growth, but it really isn't. The other thing about it has to come at the cost of customer experience, right, is also at odds, right? Because I think what people tend to focus on, right, I think is more that, oh, it has to be rapid. But rapid doesn't mean crazy fast. Rapid means fast enough. And what fast enough means is a completely separate conversation to have, right? But what it certainly means is fast enough so that we can continually learn about how to sustainably grow value to users. Again, you're going to get sick of me saying this again and again, right? So it cannot come at the cost of customer experience, because if it does, you are not growing value delivered to them, which by definition means what you're doing is not practicing growth or growth hacking the way it was intended to be. The other thing, right, and we sort of touched on this earlier, right, that it's about tactics that generate quick wins. Now there is some truth to this, that yes, it is about tactics, but those tactics have to be informed by a much bigger strategy and a process. So why are we even doing these tactics, right? Like, for example, one of the most famous examples that gets thrown about is Sean's example from his time at Dropbox with the referral mechanism, right? And yeah, that was great, right? But I think the question that never gets asked, right, is why did they think about doing that, right? That wasn't just, oh, let's do a referral program out of the blue. That was likely because they did hundreds of tests that came before that to try and understand, like, how do we get more people into the product while also giving them value in the product, right? And it was those hundreds of failed tests that ultimately led them to an idea that said, hey, what about a referral program, right? And that's why that worked. So it wasn't done in isolation, right? And so, yes, we all want a quick win, right? And sometimes these tactics do generate quick wins, right? But it's not something that just comes magically. Those are tactics that are very tightly associated with an understanding of how and what value delivered, actually means. Right? The other myth, and and maybe this myth is because of people like Sean, which is that you'll find this magical growth hacker, right? And he or she will come into your company and they'll wave this magic wand, and somehow growth will get unlocked, right? And I promise you, nothing could be further from the truth, right? Because again, yeah, even if Sean was to go back to Dropbox today, like, I don't think he could realistically promise them that, oh, I'm going to give you the kind of growth you had when you first joined, right? Nobody can. And if you ever meet somebody that can promise you a certain kind of growth, right, in a certain period of time, I promise you they're lying, right? The only thing they can promise you, and they should be able to promise you, is that they will be able to accelerate your rate of learning about what works and what doesn't work for your users, right? And that is about it, right? And the only way they'll be able to do that is if they follow a systematic process, right? And that process is not just them working in isolation. In fact, you as a growth person, at a bigger company have failed when somebody asks, what is this growth hacking thing? And they say, oh, it's that thing that person does in the corner, right? You failed, right? Growth is a team sport, and everybody has to participate. And in fact, it is everybody's role in the company to participate in growth, which is why, it is also a myth that it's only the growth team that is responsible for growth. They are certainly more in the weeds of growth. They're certainly the tip of the spear for growth, but it is not just their responsibility, right? There are ideas for growth that can come from anywhere in the company. In one of my earlier days at Growth Hackers, one of the best ideas we had for engagement came from an engineer, right? Not part of the growth team, just something he thought about, right? And in fact, for the companies that do this really, really well, what everybody in the company is asking every day, to themselves, or what their managers are asking during stand-up, is how is what you are doing today going to help either learn more about or move the needle on value delivered to our users, right? And if you don't have a good answer to that question, you need to sort of think about what you're actually doing at this company, right? Because everything you do, right, your entire job, everybody's job, is to grow value delivered, right? So I think putting the onus just on the growth team just because they are the tip of the spear is absolutely wrong, and you are actually holding back a company's ability to actually grow to the extent it can if you don't think you are also responsible for growing value to your users. The last couple of things, right? So that you need a background in product or marketing. Like, I'm Exhibit A. My degrees are in biochemistry and chemistry. In fact, one of the growth leads we hired, who just who also was the growth lead at GitLab, Hila Q. Her degree is in biology. I think Sean has a liberal arts degree. Uh, right? You don't need a background in product or marketing. Can it help? Sure. Do you absolutely need it? No. Right? What you absolutely need, right, is some common sense and a sort of logical way of thinking through problems. That's all. Right? Same thing with, like, you need to know how to code. I don't know how to code. Like, I'm not saying I'm the best growth person on the planet, right? But I've had a career that's almost 10 years, doing growth. So, I think I can safely say I don't need to know. And I still never learned how to code. I don't think Sean knows how to code, and he's Mr. Growth Hacking, uh, right? And so, does it help? Absolutely. Right? Do you need to know how to code? No, there are tons of tools available, and now there's a whole low code, no code movement that people have leaned in on. You don't need to know how to do this. What you really need to know is how to think through problems sort of systematically and look at everything through the lens of, what is this going to help me learn? Right. And I think the last one is sort of a pet peeve of mine. Right. In fact, and Jorana, don't take this as any offense, but in 9 out of 10 jobs I see posted about growth are really jobs for performance marketers in disguise. Right. They're not really for growth people who will think through the entire customer experience. Right. And that's part of where the myth comes from. The other reason there's this myth that it's all about acquiring new users is because of VCs, and investors. So if there's any of you on this call, again, no offense, but it's absolutely true, because when you read all of these things in the press about our company is growing, if you dig deep into hey, what do you really mean? What they're really talking about is, oh, we had 10,000 signups in the last week, and we had 1 million signups in the last month. And signups are great, and I have an open offer to anybody who I ever talk to give me $1 million, and I can promise you I will get 1 million people to show up to your site tomorrow. What I cannot promise you is if even one of those will keep coming back the day after. Right. And that is really where growth comes from, is understanding what will make people come back. Right. So it's truly a myth that it's mainly about acquisition. Growth has if people are going to experience value and continually get value from you, it has a lot to do with using your product, which means it has a lot to do with retention, and it doesn't have to do as much with acquiring new users. So hopefully that helps clear up some of this stuff as well. Right. And so there are some pieces, right, you need to understand, right, for all of this growth stuff, for you to grow your product properly. So I'm curious again for you, to see what level of familiarity you all have with what all the pieces you might need to understand really are. So let's throw our poll out there as well. You're not wrong. You're absolutely right. That whatever you thought is important, and that might have been informed a lot by whatever you may have read, or seen videos around. Right? The correct answer really actually it's all of these things, right? And the reason it's all of these things is because it's a process, right? And but all of these things have to work in tandem with each other, right? And which is why it's a process, and which is why it's not only just about what you do, but it's about the team coming together to do whatever it is that they do, right? So it's as much about the process as it is the people involved in making this thing happen, right? And so what I have always leaned on as ultimately everything boils down to the North Star metric, right? Because this is the number that quantifies the value your product delivers, right? And this is different for every product. There's an exercise to go through to understand what this might be for your product. What I will say here is that the most common answer I hear when I ask people this is it's revenue. And for most people, that number is wrong. It is not revenue. And the reason it's not revenue is because revenue is a function of value delivered. Right? People are not in the habit of continually paying for things they don't get value from. Right? So revenue is important, but it's a lagging indicator of value delivered. Right? What a North Star metric is it's a leading indicator of value delivered, right? And especially when you have more complicated products, or products with really complicated big sales cycles, and the like, it becomes that much more important to understand what that leading indicator of value delivered really is. Right? Or if you have the kind of product which you cannot test, which I experienced, and I don't know if you can see this, I joined a company that sold these mugs. I clearly cannot A/B test this mug every week, but I had to understand what value delivered here meant, as an example, right? So I think this is sort of really critical, and everything you do again is in the service, right, of growing your North Star metric, no matter what. But to be able to grow that, you first need to understand, okay, how are all the ways our product even grows, right? And this is a simplistic depiction of it. Some of you may be familiar with this. It's called the pirate metrics, or it's called the R funnel. And the reason it's called R is because of the acronym of AARRR, which stands for acquisition, activation, retention, revenue, and referral, right? But really, this applies to any product, right? Every product has this universe of questions that it's trying to solve for, right? Which is, how will more people, how will users find out about us? How do we give them a great first experience? How do we get them to come back? How will we make money from them? And how do we get them to talk about us to our friends and family, right? And there you can almost you can think about this very simplistically, right? If I have 100 people coming to me every week, great. 50 people sign up because they have a great first experience. 40 of those come back. I make money from 30 of them, and 20 of them tell my friends and family, right? So if I look at that, I started off with 100, I ended up with 20, right? And them going through each of these steps is basically what is sort of the fancy representation. It's just a mathematical representation of your entire customer experience, which is nothing but your growth model, right? And your job as somebody doing growth is to understand where in all of these questions is my biggest opportunity, or where is my biggest problem, right? Because wherever the biggest opportunity or the problem is where you focus on, right? Because if you solve for that problem or that opportunity, right, then more people have a chance to go through your product experience and experience value, right? And that's how your product grows, right? So again, just going back to that very simplistic example, if 100 people show up, of which 50 people sign up, 40 people come back, 30 people pay me, and 20 people tell their friends and family, my biggest problem is that half the people that showed up didn't even sign up, right? Me trying to do the Dropbox referral program because that's what I've read as the greatest growth hack on the planet, right, isn't going to help me because I'm starting from a base of 20 people, right? Whereas if I can get more people to sign up of those 100 people and make that 50 into 80, right, now more people have a chance of coming back, have more chances for making money from those people, and even more people who will talk about me to my friends and family, right? And that's all this process is, right, is understanding what are all the key steps that help people experience value, right? How do I mathematically represent them as numbers, and then how do I focus on them with some tests or hypotheses to grow that number for that step, because targeting that step is how I make my product grow, right? And so there are really three ways to think about this, right? The way your product will grow will either be, okay, get more people through, right? Which again, goes through, which is why there's part of this myth of, it's all a fancy word for marketing, right? Because that's just bringing people through, to your doorstep. That's one way, right? The other way is, okay, let's just get them to go further through the product experience, right? Because if more people are getting stuck on step 2, how can we get more of them to get to step 3 or step 4 or step 5, right? Or if I'm already getting people through that experience, right, how do I get them to sort of experience more of that value again and again, right? Because experiencing it once is clearly not enough, right? And so these become 3 very simple ways for you to look at, okay, if I understand how to grow, what value delivered means, here are 3 ways I can think it through to then understand, okay, which of these is my biggest problem, right? And let me focus there to then understand how I can grow value delivered by making more of one of these 3 things happen, right? And so when we look at this sort of as a process, right, we've spoken about, let's start on the left, we've spoken about what our North Star metric is, right? We use that to then inform, okay, we ask the questions of, what does our product experience look like? What does that mathematically look like? And if I have a, problem between step 2 and 3, okay, that becomes my focus area, right? And so what this is basically you as a growth person or a growth team, zooming out and saying, okay, where's the problem in the entire universe, right? And once you've sort of identified where the problem is, right, then you sort of zoom in, right, and say, here's where I'm focusing now, right? And so this is something you may already have come across, right? Is once you identify a focus area, right, that's when your team can start ideating around, okay, what are ideas we can come up with that can move more people from step 2 to step 3, right? And those are the only ones we will consider right now, because that's what our focus area is. Right? There is a process to prioritize. The process we used was called, the ICE score, which is impact, confidence, and ease. Just assigning on a 1 to 10 score for impact, confidence, and ease, averaging those numbers and say, okay, which of these ideas have the highest potential score? And let's do those first, right? Because we want to try out the things that have, give us the, not only either the biggest potential impact or will give us the biggest potential learning, right? We test out those ideas, and then sort of learn from those, right? And so it's this constant process of we tried something, we learned from it. What are we going to do differently based on that? The differently could be either double down on what we've already learned as working or do something completely different, right? And this is a process you keep going through until you've sort of extracted all of the gains you can. And for most products, a robust, rigorous testing process of about 3 months kind of tells you that you'll have extracted most of the biggest gains from that particular focus area. And once you have, you can get back into this zooming out phase and say, okay, we've solved getting from step 2 to step 3 as much as we can. Where's the next big problem, or where's the big opportunity now for us? Let's evaluate that. And once we have, zoom back in, follow the process, right? Because if you move the needle on your focus area, right, moving people from step 2 to step 3, right, by definition, what that means is you have now created more opportunities for value delivered, which should then be reflected in your North Star metric moving up and to the right as well. And if you've chosen the right North Star metric, you should also see a corresponding impact in your revenue numbers moving up and to the right as well, right? So all of these numbers are sort of linked between your focus area, your North Star metric, and your revenue, right? And sometimes people have a problem with this, and the reason they have a problem is because they haven't linked these numbers correctly or haven't identified these numbers correctly in a way that says, hey, if this was the wrong focus area, right, I could crush that number as much as I wanted, but if that didn't move the needle on value delivered, I was probably focusing on the wrong area, right? So maybe I need to zoom out again, right? Or I could maybe move my focus area metric and my North Star metric, but I don't see a corresponding movement in my revenue numbers. Like, have we picked the North Star metric or not, right? So this gives you sort of multiple lens to evaluate, like, are we doing the right things, and are we doing the most impactful things as well, right? And so the thing that we used at GrowthHackers, and I still use, right, this is a screenshot of actually this process Sean made us follow, and I still follow this, right? And for some products it's weekly, for some it's bi-weekly, but the goal of this, right, is to create a cadence of rapid learning, right? Because this is what sort of makes most growth programs fail is, oh, we've done a test once every couple months, maybe, or we've done a small test here or there. It's like until you can develop the muscle, it's like going to the gym. It's a bit painful to start, but once you start, you can start to test more and more things as you get more comfortable with that process, right? But the goal of this process, right, is as much to test and learn fast as it is to align the entire organization around, hey, are we focused on the right area, or are we even picking the right ideas to test? And because nobody is ever going to have, one person is going to have the best idea to test, or somebody working in product who has an idea is not going to have a complete sense of how much engineering effort it might be to get a test launched or not. And so if you have these groups working in concert together, then you have the opportunity for them to sort of collaborate around, okay, we want to test X or we want to do Y activity because our hypothesis says that we have a certain gain that we can expect if things work, and our hypothesis says that the gain will be X, Y, or Z, right? And because that gain that we see will happen, from the test perspective, we then expect to see a similar movement in our focus area metrics, and we expect to see a corresponding, increase of A, B, and C in our North Star metric, and that's why we'll do it. And so everybody is agreed on, okay, here's why we're really doing what we're doing, right? And this weekly or bi-weekly growth meeting is a great vehicle for ensuring organizational alignment, around any and every growth activity. Right? So that sort of brings us sort of almost towards the end, right? So, and I've given you a sort of bit of a clue, but again, I'm curious to hear what people have heard, right? Because there are certain practices that can be applied in certain scenarios, right? But I'm curious what you all think as to what kind of businesses could this process be applied to. So, and I think this is our last poll as well. All right. So clearly, I think almost everybody was on the same page, right? That a process of testing and learning can be applied to pretty much any kind of business, right? I mean, now the reason it's almost any kind of business, because there are really some kinds of businesses you can't do this with, right? And the reason for that is because to be able to test and learn rapidly, you need a certain volume of users coming through every day, right? And so there are certain kinds of businesses that are very low volume, so your ability to test and learn is sort of hampered in that sense. Having said that, you can apply that process that you would to an entire product experience to parts of your entire business processes. So as an example, I worked at a company that sold these, right? Now, again, I can't A/B test this every week, right? And so what I had to do, while I still asked all of the questions in that R funnel, what I had to do was understand not only what is value delivered, because again, I didn't know once you bought, whether when you bought this, did you use it? Is it lying broken in a sink? What the case is. But I also had to understand then, where are my opportunities? If I can't do it in the product, where else can I do it? And those opportunities in this case applied mostly to marketing channels, and it applied to the website and the conversion rate optimization I could do on the website. But there are other places I could apply to that were very surprising to me, in that helped a lot with, indirectly with customer referrals, because I could use this to, understand why our shipping processes were the way they were. And I applied that same methodology to say, can I improve our shipping process? Right? Or there was this other company, where we worked at, where it was a long 3-4 month sales cycle. And it took a while, right, to make that final sort of sale and to actually get the customer onboarded. But we could apply the same thinking of, okay, why does it take 3 months? Right? Is there a way to reduce that sales cycle to 2 months? What can we try there? Right? Or is there something happening either in the sales department itself? Is there something that's happening in the alignment between marketing and sales? Like, where is that problem? So we applied that same zoom out process to, okay, how can we make X more efficient? And in that case, our North Star metric just became a subset of a North Star metric, where instead of overall customer value delivered, it meant a quicker sales cycle. So we had a measurable 2-month sales cycle versus a 3-month sales cycle, and let's see what we could do to optimize that process, right? So that's why I had the caveat of it can apply to almost any process, but when we talk, most times when it's talked about through the lens of a product, but it can certainly be applied to a business through the lens of its business processes as well, right? And so hopefully that gives you a sense of you feeling a little bit better and a little bit stronger in your understanding about growth and all things growth. And I know we're almost coming up. We have 5 minutes left, but we can take how many questions we can get to, and if there are others, I'm Jordana, if you want to send them over, I'm happy to answer them, or if you want to post them in the community, I can answer them within the community as well. So we don't lose those things.
Let's get started then. So I have one from Bruno Castellanos, and he's asking, does it make sense to have one North Star metric for each department? For example, sales got one North Star metric different from the marketing team.
So when we say North Star metric, we're specifically talking about it through the lens of a product. So if you're a company that has multiple products, which all provide value in completely different ways, they should each have their own North Star metric. But every department, that's dealing with that product, it clearly should have its own departmental metric, and you can call it a departmental North Star metric. But that North Star metric should be aligned with the ultimate product North Star metric, because if it's the sales department and all sales cares about is deals won, great, but those deals won have to be in the service of growing value delivered. they can't be deals won for customers that are going to cancel in the next month, right? They have to be deals won for the right kind of customers, right? So hopefully that helps.
Next one is, how do you put in simpler words for a definition for value delivered?
Well, I guess maybe a simple way is, what is that thing they do that gets them, continually using your product? It could be one thing, it could be multiple things, but there's got to be something they do, right? So it's a function of deep use, and repeat use. So if you can identify those things, those actions, then it becomes easy to quantify those actions, and that becomes your North Star metric.
Next one, as a startup working towards finding product market fit, how to find that one metric that can be focused upon to grow weekly or monthly?
Yeah. So this is going to sound really stupid, but you should ask your users. So part of finding product market fit, and Sean actually has the survey out. If somebody can put it in the chat, it's pmfsurvey.com. And one of those questions in there is, how would you describe the value you get from our product? Once you start to see a pattern there, that's likely, where your North Star metric resides.
And about growth meetings, who should be in growth meetings according to your experience?
All department heads. And ideally, if especially in the smaller companies, the CEO as well. So when we did it at GrowthHackers, Sean attended. We had the head of creative, head of analytics, clearly the growth lead, head of product, head of engineering, head of sales. Because again, it's a team sport. Everybody has to be aligned, and everybody needs to know what are we trying out, so that when they encounter something different, or they encounter a different version of a page, or a customer encounters a different version of the page, they know why that's happening, and they're not as surprised.
Right. And how do you get the CEO on board with running experiments versus focusing on a few marketing initiatives?
Excellent question. So the best way I have found, and really, if you think about it, what do CEOs care about, right? They care about hitting their revenue numbers. End of story. They don't care about your 20,000% conversion rate, or you had 500 people come to your webinar. That's all very good. Like, how many paying customers do we have? Right? And that is why a growth model is so critical for you to develop first, right? Because especially if you're a VC-backed company, let's say you're working towards a Series A, that means you need to make 1 million ARR, in the next 12 months, right? So now it's up to you as the person doing growth to understand, okay, based on what our average selling price is, and how much we're making today, how do we make up that delta to get to 1 million ARR in the next 12 months? What does our monthly, month-over-month growth need to look like in terms of acquired users or retained users need to look like for us to hit that 1 million ARR, so that you see, Mr. or Miss CEO can have a great next fundraise, right? So, and once you do that, then it becomes very easy, right, for you to say within your growth model and those steps that you've laid out, that unless we have these many signups happening every month, or unless we have these many people paying us every month, it's all over, right? Which then means I need resources to attack those two steps. That's where I'm going to be experimenting. Now, Mr. and Miss CEO, can I have some money, to go do some experiments, or resources to do experiments there? And I promise you, that's a much easier conversation than, let's just do some experiments.
Anuj, there are 2 more questions. Do you want to answer those later, or
I can go long if people want to stay.
All right, cool. So how do you pitch a growth idea to the 20 stakeholders? I have an assumption that adding X feature will improve the user experience, deliver value. How can I convince the decision makers to test my hypothesis?
Right. So there's a few pieces to this. So one is, there are 2 kinds of ideas, right, that people come up with. One are the kind where you just pull it out of your behind, right, and say, I think we should do X, right? Why? I don't know. I just think we should do it. That's one kind of idea, right? Which initially, when you're trying to convince people, those are not the kind of ideas to, sort of come up with. The kinds of ideas you want to come up with are the ones where you have either some internal or external data, right, about something having been worked. having worked somewhere, right? Or us, and it doesn't have to be a big thing. It's just that, hey, we tried, there was something different happening here. Or even though we provide ABC experience, people still do things in XYZ way. Maybe there's something there. Like, let's try and understand more about that, right? So having some information, however thin or that information may be, right? Even if you talk to 5 of your users, or you research 5 different companies that are doing something similar, that is at least a data point that informs, the confidence score that you might have for any test, right? That there's something telling me that I've either seen this work in a different context or in a similar context, or based on just how our users are behaving, I think we should try doing X differently, right? And that certainly helps your case much more, right? And the other thing, which it was a bitter lesson I learned with Sean, upfront, was coming up with the idea wasn't enough. I had to come up with a very discrete hypothesis, right? So, and the hypothesis doesn't have to be complicated, right? It's very simple. It's, if we do X differently, we expect to see Y measured through Z, right? Even just having thought that through, right, put me ahead of most people. And in fact, we had a rule for our growth meetings that we would not consider any ideas that didn't have a hypothesis associated with them, right? Because when you say we should do X, like, there are 100 different hypotheses you can associate with the we should do X, right? So which one do you mean? And how will we know it will have worked or not worked, right? So having a hypothesis, having some basic research, done behind it, and certainly, having an idea that maps to a current area of focus is really critical as well, right? Because then with these 3 pieces, you can have the conversation about, okay, of all the ideas we can consider, is this potentially the most impactful one we should consider first? Or should it be in the mix for the next sprint, or for however long we are focusing on this area, right? So it's a much more granular conversation to have, when you backed it up with a well thought out hypothesis, a clear correlation to the current area of focus, right? And some background internal and or external data that's, informs why should we even do this.
I think that's answered. Next question. How many experiments do you try getting done each sprint? How do you calculate the growth experiment might take to be executed?
Right. So there's a 2-part answer here. So what Sean has always advocated for, and something I still shoot for, right, is try to launch at least 3+ tests a week, because that's how you learn rapidly. Now, most people cannot do that when they start. It's hard to even get 1 test launch, right? So I would first shoot for that. Try to get 1 launched every week for, the first month. So can you get 4 tests launched in a month? And I promise you, a lot of people fail here too, either because, oh, I forgot, oh, the person was on vacation or was sick, or, oops, we forgot to do XYZ for it, whatever it may be. But those are all things that tell you more about, okay, what are considerations we should have upfront if we are going to be able to successfully launch a test every week, right? And sort of a caveat even to that, right, is that what a lot of people talk about is that, hey, you need a big enough volume to launch tests, right? So because you need a certain level of users or a certain level of usage to be able to get some statistically significant results. And that is true, but that is not the first kind of test most people do, right? Or certainly should do. The first kind of test most people should be doing and they don't do are what are called discovery tests. These are your big swings. These are the kinds of tests which are, we have never done this before kind of tests. Now, the stuff you get, you read about, right, is all about, here's how HubSpot changed that CTA from red to green and they got a 20% conversion. That is great. That is a second kind of test. That's an optimization test. There were likely 100 other tests they did before that, before they came to, okay, here is where we can focus on for our next, series of, growth experiments, and where we can expect our next bit of growth to come from, right? And so the first kind of tests are very, let's just do something differently. Let's say, uh, it's the difference between, we have a very short homepage which you don't scroll on versus a homepage that you have to scroll 10 times on. That's a radically different test to be doing versus, the first test that people do is, I'm just going to test 2 different headlines on my homepage. That's an optimization test, right? So it's when you do these smaller tests is when by definition you need more data, which is why you need statistical significance, right, to tell you whether that test worked or not. When really what you should have been doing is the bigger tests, upfront, which are not about getting statistical significance as much as just giving you a signal that, hey, should I even spend more time understanding more about what's going on here or not, right? And those big tests don't have to be big changes you necessarily make or have to code, right? You just have to think very differently about what am I trying to learn, right? And then try to think of what is the smallest thing I can do to learn this thing that I think I want to learn. And if I cannot do a small thing, probably the kind of thing I want to learn is probably made up of smaller things I can learn. There are pieces I need to learn. So an example of this, that was the first time I got shot down when I came up with a big thing, was when we wanted in the community to create a to-do list, which was an idea we stole from Quora, which I thought was a great idea for onboarding. And Sean was like, that to-do list is 100 different tests. Which one do you want to do first? Right. And so I had to break that down into, let me break it down into one thing that I want people to do first. And let me learn systematically about if I make them do one thing versus the 10 things, do people even do that one thing? Right. And does doing that one thing help them engage in the community more? Right. So I think again, it's a longer way to say, think about everything through the lens of minimum viable tests, and through the lens of what you really want to learn, right? And those initial tests that you do should be radically different versions of things to the extent possible. And as you learn from these radically different things, whether something is actually different or better, and you focus there, and then you do smaller and smaller tests, those will become your optimization tests that then will need, maybe more tooling, more data, more statistical significance right there. So that's been my approach.
And final question, which is a good tool to track experiments and related learnings?
Oh, come on. No, no, of course, because I worked at GrowthHackers, my experience mostly has been with what is now experiments, and it's a great tool. But I think when you're starting out, I think you just want a place to capture learnings. Right? And that's really the most important thing to do, right? It's not as much about the process of, we have all our ideas. You can use a Google Sheet, you can use Trello, you can use all of that, right? But I think the trap that's waiting for people is that you get too focused on, we have to follow all of these steps, we have to ideate, and we have to have an I score, and we have to have, a central knowledge base, and all of that, is great, and yes, but you want to work your way there. So I think the most important thing, when whatever tool you choose to use, at least at the start, is if we are trying new things out, can we at least have a central place where we capture what we did and what we learned, so we know what we can either double down on or do different moving forward, right? And start there. And once you start doing it that way, you will naturally start to hit, things that will come in the way of you being able to operate more efficiently, and then use that as your trigger to move on to more purpose-built tools. A screenshot, I'm on LinkedIn. For the people that are enthused, in fact, I'd really be interested, for the people that are still hanging around, like, what was your big takeaway or big aha moment, or one biggest thing you learned? I'd love to see that in the chat before you go as well. I'm always curious about what people should understand versus what I think they actually understood from this entire thing. So I'd love to see some responses in there.